Dear colleagues, dear friends, dear students, buongiorno a tutti. Very well, welcome to the second day of our conference, Hidden in Plain Sight. A warm welcome also to the people who attend the conference online. Yesterday we had wonderful lectures and very lively discussions, and of course, this is something we want to continue today. And the program is very, very promising. So the next speaker is Venice and Genoa. In a way, he doesn't need any introduction, but nevertheless. Venice Geronimus is professor and chair of the Department of Art History at New York University. His research interests include artistic cross-currents between Italy and Northern Europe, as well as between Africa and the Mediterranean. Artist engagement with the natural world, mythological narrative, and other forms of storytelling, and pictorial wit and humor. As Michael mentioned in his introduction yesterday, at the start of our conference, he is the author of Periodicosimo, Vision, People and Strange, published in 2006. In 2015, Dennis co-curated with Gretchen Hirschauer the first ever exhibition on Piero at the National Gallery of Art in Washington. And more recently, he has written on the interconnections between Michelangelo, Jacopo da Pontormo, and Vittoria Colonna. And in 2021, he collaborated with Nicholas Hall in New York on Gray Methods, an exhibition conceived around the theme of monochrony and inspired by the rediscovery of Pontormo's Adam and Eve grisaille. He's currently at work on a monograph entitled Jacob da Pontormo, Overcoming Nature. And the title of today's talk is The Black Duke's Daughter, Absence and Presence in a Pontormo.
Thank you so much, Jan, and I'd like to thank once again both Michael and as everyone else has as well, if I can expand the thanks to the entire NIKI staff, of course, Lex, who has been absolutely heroic, both behind and in front of the scenes. And I would be remiss not to thank Daphne and Julia. Where's Julia? Oh, in the back. And also Emma, who has been keeping the NIKI spotless for you at 6 in the morning. It's been a team effort, and I cannot thank all of you enough. If I may, I would like to also dedicate this talk to Serena Padovani, whom I was lucky to call a friend, and who was as uncompromising a scholar as she was generous and kind. Stories, like so many others, are also stories of forgetting. Our calling as historians, to echo Marissa and so many of our other speakers, is to try to recover long-lost lives, to fill the gaps and erasures, to give voice to those who are silent. The story I have to tell this morning takes us from 1530s Medici in Florence to 1930s Baltimore. It's a story that begins in the studio of Jacopo da Pontormo, an intensely personal artist best known today for the visionary color and figural rhythms of his devotional works. As you can see, of course, here, just about a half an hour walk away in his deposition in Santa Felicita's Capponi Chapel. Yet, Pontormo reserved his most sensitive psychological insights for his drawings, and especially his portraits, each as a seeming paradox of individual personhood and emotional reticence. And nowhere is this more evident than in his representations of youth. His painted adolescents projecting as best as they can an air of self-assurance to the outside world, while all the while, just under the surface, harboring an anxious vulnerability. It's almost as if I like to imagine that despite the terrifying moment of the siege of Florence, Francesco Guardi is almost playing soldier, even though, of course, he's not. And the young man at right almost seems to wear a coat that's too big for himself. Theirs is a guarded ease, They are scrutinizing us as if discerning our real intentions, perhaps more carefully than we're studying them. And this, I have to say, stands in quite stark contrast to the rambunctiousness of the joy of his infants, as you can see here. And I had an ulterior motive for also including this work because Valentine brought up the Pucci family. This is, of course, the Palla Pucci, also here in the city's Church of San Michele Vesdomini. When Pontormo's present likeness, painted around 1539, entered the conservation department of the Walters Art Museum in Baltimore in 1937, almost 400 years since its production, it looked like this. Imagine, I've been asking you to imagine a great deal the last 2 days, but try to imagine the restorer's surprise when, upon cleaning, like an apparition, the panel's long-held secret at last became revealed on the laboratory easel. From that moment forward, the painting and its young subject came to life in an extraordinary way. Here we see the now double portrait in its present state. Meet Giulia Romola de' Medici, born approximately in 1535, here shown at the age of 4 or 5. Pontormo's work is a study in monochromy, dominated by black, by mouse grays and browns. The pale rose of Giulia's garment is the sole spot of color. This was and remains a painting with a very complicated history, and for at least a century, nothing about it was as it seemed. For the once invisible child that now shyly meets our gaze may represent the first girl of African descent in all of European art. The child's inclusion in the composition, followed by her vanishing and subsequent return to visibility, raises a whole host of questions. They range well beyond forensic detection, from familial relations and ancestry to childhood, and to the still more complex politics of race and gender in the early modern period. Here, it is instructive to briefly also situate Pontormo's double portrait within a broader Renaissance visual and social context. And I will show those examples to you shortly because they're still coming up. But the painting in Baltimore that was acquired in 1902 by Henry Walters, to give you some of its history, was bequeathed to the collection in 1931 in what was to become the Walters Art Museum. At that time, the lone figure, a widow based on her somber attire as seen at left, came to be commonly identified as Vittoria Colonna, a paragon of piety and the most celebrated female poet in all of 16th century Italy. A close friend and spiritual counselor of Michelangelo, whom she first met in Rome soon after 1534, Colonna exchanged letters and poems with the artist. And Michelangelo, 17 years her senior, on occasion gifted her drawings of intensely devout subjects, 2 surviving and glimpsed here. And I'm sorry that I put this a little bit out of order, but this is an image of Vittoria Colonna and 2 letters exchanged by Vittoria writing to Michelangelo in the 1540s, and on the right, the sculptor writing to her. And just in 2019 or so, by the way, this image came on the market in Sotheby's London. And even though this figure is not holding what I believe would have been a medal, but a quill, this has been identified, in fact, with Vittoria Colonna as well. So even in pose, quite similar. And this is, sorry, I'm jumping back just briefly. And as I mentioned before, it's instructive to also situate Pontormo's double portrait within a broader Renaissance visual and social context. And this was the pair of images I meant to show you slightly earlier in this narrative, but they're 2 contemporary Italian artists who are, I'm sure, very familiar to you, Paris Bordone and Titian, who represent Black children in the companies of figures of white authority. And needless to say, in its emotional poignancy, Pontormo's image stands out all the more for the comparison. And it's also worth noting that two other visual parallels of concealment and revelation emerged from history later than Pontormo's, but I think very much worth discussing. As first noted by Victor Serrao and then Didier Lahome, approximately a quarter of a century ago, in publications from 2000 and 2005, a Black figure was discovered during the restoration of the high altarpiece in the Church of the Monastery at Belém in Lisbon, seen here. Executed in 1570 to 72, one of the Passion panels showing Christ carrying the cross features the three Marys in the background, joined by a male bystander. As distinctly visible here, I hope, one of the Marias, with only her face visible in the back, is Black. This may seem but a small minor detail, were it not for the fact that this figure disappeared during the restoration back as early as 1673, only to be revealed approximately 325 years later. My second example is certainly better known, coming as it does from the hand of none other than Artemisia Gentileschi. And where is Melissa? I know you know this work. Among her most ambitious early panels is this canvas, now at the Metropolitan Museum, and it depicts the Jewish heroine Esther appearing before her husband, King Ahasuerus of Persia, to persuade him to halt an order calling for the annihilation of the Jewish people. In doing so, she violates court protocol, thereby risking death. Rather than focusing on the fainting Esther or the king, who is about to in fact grant her request, I want to direct your attention to a ghostly silhouette. I hope it's readily visible here. Turning back, in fact, to look directly at the fainting queen. This silhouette haunting the foot of Ahasuerus' throne once defined a Black male servant, originally shown restraining a dog. When studying the painting in normal light today, the head of the Black youth is readily visible as a pentimento. As confirmed to me very recently by Dorothy Mann of the Met, in the most recent treatments in the 1990s, there was no attempt whatsoever to conceal the pentimento with retouching. And as we can clearly see, both the youth and the dog were ultimately painted out by the artist in the final iteration of this highly theatrical scene. And by the way, on the subject of stagecraft, there's so many rich connections between this and especially the Commedia dell'arte tradition, and this has been borne out in the wonderful work of Emily Wilborn, a musicologist teaching at CUNY Grad Center in New York and others. And I'll be very, very glad to discuss what I'm sure is puzzling you at least as much as it puzzled me, this somewhat strange looking X-ray illustrated at right, or more specifically, why this composite image's strange blacked out appearance appears exactly where the figure, or almost exactly where the figure of the Black youth would have been, while clearly revealing instead the hound that he restrains. So I'd be more than happy to discuss this, but it's quite technical. To return to Pontormo's example, the image continues to beguile, evoking as many questions as answers. Yet no question is as intriguing, as urgent as why? Why was the girl covered up and thus erased from history? To find the most likely answer for her absence, we must follow the chain of ownership in first determining when and by whom could this strategic cancellation have been made. And at this point, I absolutely have to thank Jonita Spicer and Karen French, the conservator at the Walters, for their generosity in sharing a great deal of material with me, and also the history of the painting with me in years past. This certainly includes the technical evidence post-conservation of 1937. As early as 1612, in an inventory of paintings of the wealthy Riccardi family's rural estate of Valfonda, the panel not only mentioned the child, but referred to her as una putina, a little girl. Fast forward, however, 200 years later, In an inventory from 1814 of art objects belonging to the descendants of the Salviati family, the painting now is generically identified as, quote, a woman and child. The gender has been obscured. Later in the same century, the panel resurfaces in the collection of Don Marcello Massarenti, who lived from 1817 to 1905. It resurfaces in Rome at this time. Massarenti was a Vatican official who served Pope Pius IX. He was charged with the responsibility of performing charitable works on behalf of the Pope. And his collection was purchased in its entirety 3 years before his death in 1902 by Henry Walters, and was to form the nucleus of the Walters collection in Baltimore. In the 1881 catalog of the Massarenti collection, however, the painting is now titled Vittoria Colonna. Consequently, at some point between the years 1814 and 1881, our Putina was rendered invisible and was to remain thus for anywhere between 56 and 123 years until being uncovered yet again in 1937. These are the drawings between Michelangelo and Vittoria. There are at least 3 plausible scenarios that need to be considered for the disappearance. And I have to admit, the first is the most technical and the most unsentimental of them all. And it's namely the panel's condition. Here I show you an X-radiograph that Karen French shared with me. I don't have to tell you that it has suffered over the years, and it more critically shows the outlines of the composition as painted by the artist using lead white paint. This, by the way, also helps explain some of the rather fugitive aspects of the Artemisia Gentileschi canvas that I'd be happy to discuss with you. The painting was very abraded, to say the least. However, the bottom section in which the child is located does not betray any kind of extensive damage, less than the right side proper of the companion figure of Maria Salviati, for example. And thus, it probably would not have necessitated a dramatic intervention, certainly not a complete overpainting of a figure by a 19th century hand. In fact, that ironically, in a way, the expressive, very sensitively rendered face of little Julia, having been covered up and thus unwittingly protected for many decades by overpaint, is especially well preserved today. So what might be a likelier reason for the little girl's disappearance? Market forces, commerce and capital, and issues of taste do not, I admit, at least in this emotionally charged case, make for the most moving narrative. But they are nonetheless very revealing. Most likely, as Jonate Spicer also believes, the child's existence was erased for reasons of profit. Although the following remains hypothetical, it is most likely that in the interim that I mentioned, in other words, between 1814 and 1881, the panel came into the possession of a dealer. The latter no doubt knew that few collectors would want to buy a portrait of just any old woman. The main sitter was in need of a good story. The most celebrated and thus saleable widow of the Italian Renaissance. And they titled it just that, Vittoria Colonna. She spent the remaining years of her life after her husband Ferdinando Francesco d'Avalos's death at war in 1525. They married in 1509 when Colonna was just 17 years old. Vittoria Colonna, from that point on, lived as a secular guest in convents, and she died childless, however. Our woman's young charge, meanwhile, was most likely painted out with very little knowledge as to Julia's true identity. She just simply didn't belong. Nor was she likely painted out because of her gender or her ancestry as a kind of damnatio memoriae. And yet, what a fascinating, complicated identity we encounter in this little girl. Instead, more likely than not, the child was painted over because any child would have lowered the painting's desirability and its price. I have left for last a third potential explanation, which to my mind is the most profoundly interesting and the most powerful, even if not necessarily the most probable. It is that of race, and more specifically in this case, the perceived sins of the father. The 19th century dealer or collector or amateur painter who so radically disfigured Pontormo's portrait need not have feared that the older woman's identity would have been compromised by the painting's inclusion of the child, that its importance would have been devalued. After the cleaning of 1937, research by Edward King, a curator at the Walters at the time, who later became its director, revealed the woman to be another widow entirely. The great noblewoman Maria Salviati, painted again by Pontormo as seen at right, possibly posthumously. Daughter of Lucrezia di Lorenzo de' Medici and Jacopo Salviati, and rose to become the matriarch of the Medici house, esteemed for her intelligence and the strength and independence of her convictions. In 1516, at the age of 17, another age that might resonate with you, given Vittoria Colonna's life, she married the fierce military commander Giovanni della Bandinere, so named after his black armor. She, like Vittoria Colonna, was widowed shortly thereafter, 10 years after their marriage, but not before bearing a son. The couple's sole offspring was to become the most powerful of all scions of the celebrated Medici family tree, Cosimo I de' Medici, future Duke of Florence in 1537, when he was recorded here by Pontormo, and the future Grand Duke of Tuscany in 1569. And it was with young Cosimo that Edward King originally identified the child that Pontormo represented. Striking contradictions soon arose, however. The child, for instance, has braided hair and clearly wears clothing most becoming of a girl. With regard to the former clue, we see a very similar hairstyle adopted by young Didamia, represented in another female double portrait, this time one of the companion canvases from Venice, also in the Walters collection, and executed by Paolo Veronese, as seen here at right. Boys in this period sported short hair and wore more structured clothing, as seen in Didamia's brother Leonida at left. It wasn't until 1992 that another scholar, Gabriel Langdon, in collaboration with Mario de Valdez y Cocon, a historian of the African diaspora, conclusively identified the visibly worried child as a girl, whom Maria Salviati, and also, by the way, her son Cosimo, once Duke, were to protect throughout her young life, none other, again, than the orphaned ward, Giulia de' Medici. After her husband's death in battle in 1526, Maria Salviati, now impoverished, as her husband had spent most of his money on the upkeep of his troops, spent the next decade in retirement at the Palace of Trebbia outside of Florence, devoting herself entirely to looking after her son. In the 11th year, 1537, everything changed, as she became responsible for the well-being of more than one child. It was in that year that Giulia's father, Alessandro de' Medici, was murdered. Although his likeness, his face is now gone, it is very possible that a commemorative medal that Salviati holds in her left hand was of her late husband, as seen in this example here, also from the Met. Also plausibly, the medal may have displayed Alessandro himself. In several fascinating instances, both Alessandro and his successor, Salviati's son Cosimo de' Medici, were indeed depicted, here at bottom on the self-same medal. Salviati, having suffered great loss and shown wearing her widow's weeds in the Baltimore portrait, has now taken on the role of protector to a little girl who found herself bereft. Both women found themselves marked by otherness. In Pontormo's typically intimate rendering of character, the aristocratic grace projected by Maria Salviati is clearly countered by Giulia's palpable sense of vulnerability. A mix of shyness and concern, her expression betrays what is to be an uncertain future. And here, to hopefully maybe lighten the mood a little bit, I want to also refocus our attention on Pontormo, and specifically the artist working in the privacy of their studio. And having spent a great deal of time with his drawings, I have noticed something or some things likewise hidden in plain sight. And that is what is to come in the very next slide. He, as I mentioned before, was very sensitive to not just children, but really not only the outward appearance, but the spirit or the spiritedness of children. And here I'm showing you a young boy posing almost certainly as a young St. John the Baptist in this drawing from the late 1520s. All of these sheets are from the Uffizi. And this is part of a double-sided drawing that he was probably working on while working on the Capponi Chapel frescoes in Santa Felicita. And on its other side is this. So you have to, in fact, turn it with a little spatula-like device. You have to turn it on its side, and on the back, even though this is typically referenced as the recto, one sees what appears to be a really brilliantly modeled in terms of both form and texture drapery study, until one looks at the bottom register of this sheet. This is, of course, kind of the area of central interest to anyone encountering this sketch. But the bottom reveals this. And I'd love to discuss this perhaps in the Q&A, but to me, these are children's doodles. And this, if anything, further belies the idea of Pontormo as an antisocial misanthrope or a curmudgeon. It would seem that Pontormo allowed kids into his workspace. And there is and by the way, you know, if you've ever looked at Pontormo drawings, even a tendon out of place is unthinkable, as would have been the case with Albrecht Dürer. And there is a precedent for this, even though this would have been almost certainly the hand of an older adolescent, but this is a sheet, in a double-sided sheet as well, in fact, from the Ashmolean, that may include doodles by someone like Antonio Mini, who, given the year of his birth, probably would have been, I'm thinking about 16 or 17. Giulia's father, Alessandro, was most likely born of a liaison between Cardinal Giulio de' Medici, as many of you know, the future Pope Clement VII, and a servant, a Black African woman thought to have been Simonetta da Collavecchio. It bears note here that there's now a growing amount of excellent scholarship on Alessandro, with contributions by John Brackett and Catherine Fletcher, especially valuable in their insights. As Alessandro's heir, along with her older brother Giulio, little Giulia, like her brother named after their grandfather, the Pope, who died in 1534, initially would have been considered a threat, and thus a potential target by those who orchestrated Alessandro de' Medici's ambush. The youngest sister, Porzia, was placed in the Augustinian convent of San Clemente. Giulia shared a nursery, meanwhile, with Cosimo's illegitimate daughter, Bea, who died at the age of 5 at 1542. But Pontormo's young girl looks nothing like Bronzino's celebrated portrait of Bea in the Uffizi. All three children were illegitimate. In a move governed largely by shrewd political motivations, Maria Salviati's then 17-year-old son, Cosimo, with no heir of his own, agreed to act as guardian to both Giulia and Giulia. Maria Salviati and Alessandro would have been cousins once removed by marriage, and she too played a central role in the children's care. Their survival, after all, represented Medici continuity, and Pontormo's painting, in effect, constituted a visual document of Cosimo de' Medici's good faith. And on the subject of care, just very briefly, I also want to mention the work of Sharon Strocchia And as illuminated by her, Maria Salviati, together with Eleonora da Toledo, were among a community of women, in this case, very much distinguished also by their class, who participated in the search for empirical therapeutic knowledge of early modern healthcare, actual household practitioners of medicine. And she was, as Strokia's title describes, one of the period's forgotten healers. So the practice and politics and also the political favor of everyday healthcare as performed by women is an absolutely fascinating new window into women's lives in this period, and not only women's lives, but also children's lives. To return to Alessandro, he did not only become Duke in his own right, but the first Duke of Florence. The title was bestowed upon him directly by Emperor Charles V upon the imperial troops' deadly siege of Republican Florence in 1530. 6 years later, Alessandro was given the hand of Emperor Charles V's daughter, Margaret of Austria, then but 16, in marriage. Their union was to last approximately 6 months. Alessandro proved to be a deeply divisive and unpopular ruler. His political opponents did taunt him for the, quote, ignominy of his blood, unquote. But it's difficult to know for certain whether they were deriding him for his mixed race or his bastard birth. The first instance, when he was explicitly deemed Black, seems to occur as late as 1564. His reign as Duke came swiftly and brutally. On a winter night, on January 6, 1537, Alessandro was lured to a mistress's bed where, his chainmail now off, he was stabbed and slashed to death by 3 assassins. He was 26. The chief conspirator was a kinsman and Alessandro's companion, Lorenzino or Lorenzaccio de' Medici. Lorenzino subsequently was declared by Filippo Strozzi as a, quote, Tuscan Brutus, although rumor had it that he was deathly afraid of handling weapons himself, so he sent assassins to kill his kinsman. And it's all like a Verdi opera, and in fact, Lorenzino's murder and Alessandro's history also inspired 2 plays, as I'm sure Daphne de Cinto knows, by Alexandre Dumas and Alfred de Musset. Lorenzino himself was murdered in turn in March 1547, most likely, as it has been argued, in a vendetta carried out by Emperor Charles's henchmen. Emperor Charles's daughter was now a widow. And we cannot forget that although Alessandro was anything but a devoted husband, his blameless daughter was in fact widowed by Lorenzino's actions. Possibly only a matter of months before painting Cosimo's previously seen profile portrait, Pontormo painted his less fortunate predecessor, Duke Alessandro, on at least 2 to 3 occasions. And here I show you the largest composition, which now hangs in Philadelphia. It is a portrait within a portrait of sorts, as we, the beholder, are placed in the position of subject, most likely in the position of Taddeo Malaspina, whose profile the Duke lovingly traces without taking his eyes off of his mistress, off of us. And he does so with a knitting needle. This is a makeshift metal point. In 1536, as I mentioned, he married he married Margaret, but it was Taddea who was really Alessandro's true beloved, and most likely the mother of Julia herself. The now orphaned Julia, meanwhile, looks white to many, and I will return to that in my final words. The now orphaned Julia, meanwhile, looks white to many, if not most visitors to the Walters who encounter the painting even today. Indeed, it is arguably Julia's features, not her skin tone, that most individualize her and lend a clue as to her true identity. Comparing Maria Salviati's impossibly elongated fingers to those of her young ward, their pigmentation is almost undistinguishable in their almost marmoreal stone-like pallor. The complexities of Pontormo's double portrait in this context may in turn encourage us to see the art of more recent artistic traditions also in a new and nuanced light. And I cannot help but conclude by looking forward to a contemporary example, which you just glimpsed, one in which blackness as skin color is replaced literally on the surface with a light charcoal grayscale here with taupe undertones. And so speaking of Baltimore, here is no doubt familiar to many or all of you, Amy Sherrill's official portrait of Michelle Obama. It's a very large portrait measuring about 6 by 5 feet that was unveiled at the National Portrait Gallery in 2018, along with Kehinde Wiley's very different portrait of Barack Obama. It is a representation of quiet power. Although if anyone has ever seen Michelle Obama's biceps, her power, I think, is anything but understated. I was struck in reading Sherrill's artist statement by a possible parallel to what we've now seen when she explains her use of a kind of ghostly grayscale, creating an effect that is otherworldly, as she said it. And this has also been described by Doreen St. Felix in The New Yorker, my favorite article, an interview of Amy Sherrill. And in this interview, throughout her portraits, Amy Sherrill calls the use of this particular grisaille, as it's often been called, as a way to, quote, exclude the idea of color as race. As St. Felix herself comments, quote, applied to Michelle Obama, the lack of brown in the skin feels first like a loss and then like a real gain, unquote. An image at once public and somehow very private, the portrait is almost above or beyond race. On a number of occasions, Sherrill has pointed to early 19th and 20th century photographs as a source powerfully haunting her paintings. And here I show her now well-known photograph of her grandmother, Jewel, at right. And looking well beyond American borders to Mali, we encounter another no less arresting parallel of monochromy, the gelatin silver print studio portraits of Seydou Keita, also striking for being at once spectral and ever present. In their phantasmal monotone presence, Sherrill's subjects, famous for representing the everyday, more so than Michelle Obama certainly, thus become something bigger than a flesh and blood sitter. They have the potential to become, in Sherrill's words, an archetype. In Giulia de Medici's case, something different happens. The neutralization of color largely obscures any sense of difference. Her whiteness becomes a form of concealment or self-preservation. It's a kind of camouflage. There is in this sense also a power of elusiveness, even invisibility, especially in precarious times. And finally, on the subject of invisibility, Black protagonists, particularly children's marginalization in old master paintings, has animated much of the work of an artist active today, just like Amy Sherrill. And I would be remiss not to show some Dutch art at this conference. And here we see a painting of Frans Hals, countered by Titus Kaffar, also an artist working on the East Coast in the States, in New Haven, who reconfigures and thus subverts past works to reveal unspoken truths about the nature of history, and those for centuries ignored or erased, acts of disclosure, as he calls it, that speak, quote, to the power of rewritten history. In closing, Pontormo's double portrait thus would have served as confirmation or validation of the ruling Medici's family's guardianship of Giulia. It is at once a visual document and a moving token of renewal and hope. Giulia herself went on to marry well, taking as her husband the patrician Bernardetto de' Medici, whom you see at right, in 1559, a member of the family's cadet branch, like Duke Cosimo I. The latter sent 200 horsemen to the wedding celebrations. Giulia's dowry would have been the equivalent of almost $9 million today. Giulia lived to be 53. She died in 1588. Later in life, she appears to have withdrawn herself from Cosimo and largely disappears from sources. Giulia and Bernardetto had a son. They named him Alessandro. He became the Lord of Atiano and general of the Pontifical Army from April 1605 until his death the following year at the age of 46. He had at least 2 sons of his own. But this is another story for another time. For today, it must suffice to honor and celebrate Maria Salviati's strength of devotion and courage, and above all, the resilience and grace of young Julia, who has been restored to us, her personal story redeemed, no longer silent, now fully in plain sight. Thank you.